Many stories of the pages of our history textbooks lack credibility, but out of them all, the story of Genghis Khan seems to be a crown jewel of all unbelievable fictions. The textbooks assure us how fearsome army of Mongolian warriors swept all through Asia and Europe, defeated everybody, reaching all the way to Egypt even. With great confidence we are being assured that the Mongolians came in big swarms. And it all sounds as if the historians have seen it with their own eyes and have written it down. But in the professional literature for historians, there is a completely different picture. Over there we read that the actual army was composed of Russian Tatars and there were only few Mongolians on the top. Of course, how could there have been big swarms of Mongolian troops if there have never been swarms of any people at any time in Mongolia? Just 2 centuries ago, its full population was barely 500,000. Even according to mainstream history data, at the supposedly the time of Genghis Khan in Mongolia lived just a very small handful of couple of thousand people. Till date, Mongolians are a relatively extremely peaceful and unaggressive nation. They lead a nomadic life, constantly change the location of their tents, and the idea that the men could leave the women doing all these herds of animals and assembly and disassembly of the tents is quite disconnected from reality. In addition, in terms of natural resources, Mongolia is deprived of metals and doesn't have any record of any tradition at all in terms of manufacturing any metal weaponry. That is why that story is presented in the professional historians' literature that the army was of foreigners and there were just a couple of Mongolians on the top. And how did this couple of Mongolians convince the most mighty Chinese and Russian armies to become their subservients? Well, to that question, the so-called historians just don't give any answer, skip it, and it is left to us to wonder how did they do it. Well, I came up only with 2 ideas. First of all, maybe the couple of Mongolians on the top took over the enemy's armies by scaring them with a procession of paper dragons. Another scenario that I would suggest for inclusion in those mainstream history books is that the traditional Mongolian fighters, like the ones you see on the photo, they organized a rainbow parade for the Russian and Chinese armies, and when the other side saw them, they decided, "We are your slaves forever." Not comfortable with these scenarios? Well, I'm not also extremely comfortable with some hints that they give us in the textbooks. Like, for example, the Mongolians were such good fighters that they could appear out of nowhere and then disappear. So are they telling us that he had some sort of shamans in his army that were making people visible, invisible, or something like that? Indeed, there were and still there are martial arts in those parts of Asia that would seem truly magical to us. That was spread all over the region, not just in Mongolia. And indeed, now these martial arts are present in higher, more developed levels exactly in the areas that were supposedly conquered by Genghis Khan, not Mongolia. And there is no evidence whatsoever that it was different in those times. Let's have a look at the actual historic sources. Maybe they will give us a clue who invaded Europe and Asia and how did they do it. Well, this full story of some Mongolians taking over 2, 3 continents, reaching even Africa, started to appear on the pages of the history books sometime in the 18th century. Before that, the historians didn't know anything about it. In year 1826, that wonderful institution that we mentioned in the last episode, the Russian Academy of Sciences, that foreign institution, approached all historians from local and international, offering them a substantial financial grant for compiling a story of Mongolian invasion. Had a strict requirement that the works must be submitted within 3 years. Interestingly enough, 6 years later, they came up with the very same offer again. Well, they did have a single response, a work submitted from Germany, but it was not approved. And by the way, till date, specialists in Oriental studies say that although many have tried to really delve deep into the matter, till date there is not a single comprehensive published research on this so-called invasion in either scientific or even in the form of popular literature. And still, it is accepted as history by the academia. Usually they would quote two authentic sources. One of them is an 18th century book called The Secret History of the Mongols. Even prominent mainstream Oriental historians doubt the validity of this source, and full reference can be found in the new chronology books of Anatoly Fomenko, to which I have provided links already many times. And the second source, quoted as pure and authentic, is the work of the Arabic historian Rashed ad-Din. Of course, a copy of the Golden Book miraculously emerged in St. Petersburg exactly when needed for compiling this new history. But of course, the validity of every historic document can be questioned. But what is the most disturbing here is that the first translator, Berezin, openly admits that he was pressured and forced to insert names and geographical coordinates in his translation according to his knowledge. What does it mean according to his knowledge? The translator explains in many occasions diacritic marks were missing. Those are the pronunciation marks of how the names are pronounced, and in many cases yet the very names were missing altogether. and the translator was forced to add them according to his knowledge. But the book he is translating is the main source, considered the authentic old source of this knowledge. So, if this full story of the Mongolian invasion was fabricated just the last couple of 100 years, question remains: what were people writing before that? And indeed, we have a good amount of contemporary records of how people who experienced this invasion describe it. For example, a certain person called Julian, a Hungarian missionary and witness of this invasion, describes the invaders as Tatars that were blonde Gothic people. Yes, they came from the place of Gothia. Now, this could be confusing for those who haven't read yet the books of the New Chronology by Anatoly Fomenko, where numerous quotes are given proving that in older times when people say gods, they meant actually the Slavic people. And the modern idea that these are just people of Germanic origin covers the full the full God idea, the original one, very partially. This division was artificially created at the time when the nations that mixed with the survivors and were spreading their culture, their true history needed to be blurred, and that's why at different locations they were given different names. And nowadays people think that these were altogether different people, while reality was different. You can reverse it the other way around if it is easier for you. You can consider that the Slavic people were actually gods. For example, on this old map, I apologize for the quality, I couldn't find it in color and better resolution, but there are few locations with a Gothia where gods live, and those are on the shores of the Black Sea. One is on the northwest shore, and the other one is straightforward north from the Black Sea. And the people there, according to mainstream history, are known as Slavic people. So Slavs means gods, and various historians over these centuries have figured this out even before the existence of the new chronology. And of course, a lot of relevant quotes, piles of them, are given throughout the new chronology books, because this is a very important point: how people were artificially created, how same people received different name in different location to blur their true culture and origin. Of course, modern historians will explain this account with the stupidity and ignorance of the people in the past who were writing chronicles, but amazingly enough, all the contemporary witnesses say that the people who invaded were gods, not just one, and that's a clear indication, at least, that these invaders were Caucasian people. They were not Mongolians for sure. These are all the drawings showing what people meant in those times when they say Tartars. Here, visitors from Western Europe depict what they saw when they visited the court of the Tartar prince and princess. And this is how medieval people believed Genghis Khan looks before the introduction of the new fabricated history. Marco Polo visited the direct descendants, the sons of Genghis Khan, and this is an illustration made by his contemporaries upon his return after he published his accounts of what he saw. Here you see Marco Polo being accepted by the Mongol, the Tartar king. Does he look any Mongolian to you? And now this is a modern illustration to the same book of Marco Polo. Another modern illustration, the Great Khan, looks completely different from what Marco Polo told his contemporaries when he returned. This is again old illustration of what he saw in the court of the Great Khan. And here are a few more original illustrations, contemporary, depicting what Marco Polo saw in the court of the Great Mongol. Now this is an old drawing of another Mongol ruler. Very interesting how he looks when Western European artists paint him. Now that's what you see on the right side. What did it mean actually Tartars at the time, medieval times, when contemporaries were describing the invaders as Tatars or Tartars? Nowadays, a very small and relatively unimportant province of Russia is called Tatarstan, but as we saw in the previous episode, in the past, the full region, even much bigger than Russia, even including parts of Eastern Europe, was called Tartaria. This was the name by which the country was known in the Western circles. The people that lived there themselves would identify themselves in a different fashion. The residents of what we call nowadays Mongolia were definitely some of the Tartars, because they were always part of Great Tartaria, but they were not particularly influential. That's why they are very rarely mentioned on any medieval maps, and indeed, because we see Mongols all over the place in Tartaria, usually it is somewhere else, and not the Mongols word is somewhere else in the area influenced by the survivors, and not where Mongolia is nowadays. This particular map, Mongol is placed in Siberia and not in Mongolia. Let's not forget what the medieval texts tell us. The Tartars were gods. For example, on this old map, we see Tartars all over in Eastern Europe, in what it is nowadays Bulgaria, Romania, all these countries. And centuries ago, they were part of this bigger federation that supported the last remains of the survivor culture. And those of you who are from Eastern Europe maybe will find it questionable, but we had our own kings. That's what we learned in school, right? They showed us documents with the names of our old kings, and it's in old writing. How about that? That is partially true. But when the team of the new chronology examined the actual dynasties of all these Slavic kings, ancient Bulgarians, Dacians, and so on, it transpires that these dynasties, in many cases, not all, sometimes there were local rulers as well, especially in more recent times, they are duplicates of the Khans that were the Khans of Tartaria, that huge federation that was honoring the rules of the survivors and their culture. What does it mean that they were recognized as phantom duplicates? Well, charts are made with the names of all kings, and other details are included, like the duration of their rule, also main events that happened, personal details about their families and wives, and so on. And that is done for both sets of dynasties. And this is a sample of how the resulting charts look like. And when we notice that full dynasties, the names of the kings, the years of their reign, their achievements, the actual wars, when we see that they match very, very closely, it is really a very good chance that we have a case of actual phantom dynasty. And the need of such phantom dynasties arose when this federation of Great Tartaria was removed from history. Then they had to fill up the gaps with something. And because it would have been harder to convince people that it was crocodiles from the constellation of Andromeda that were ruling the earth at that time, they had to make some sort of mixture of semi-truth and fiction that would be believable to people. And that's how these phantom dynasties appeared. That was much easier because anyway the names were pronounced differently in all countries, the name of a very same person. So the main trick was that, oh, these were different kings, this was your local king, it wasn't the head of the federation, while actually in the history records it would be something else, but that's how they twisted it. For example, the Lithuanian and Polish Tatars, um, they took part in the army of Napoleon, and that's why some artifacts from them were saved. This was their hat, and this was their symbol. It looks somewhat Muslim, but in reality, as we know from earlier episodes, the crescent sign was one of the symbols of this vast federation of nations that supported the survivors' culture. In many cases, if one visits a traditional Orthodox church in Eastern Europe and listens when the priest reads from the old text, he or she will hear something like a Boga Nashiva, which is a simple and straightforward Russian language. The time when all Slavic people belonged to a single federation were not at all far away in the past, but it looks like this because all the common elements of their culture, although they are absolutely the same, they bear different names in each country according to mainstream history. Genghis Khan, who conquered a couple of continents and created the biggest empire ever, as mainstream history assures us, was a Mongol himself. What does that mean? Did he come from nowadays Mongolia? Actually, Mongolia as independent state started existing only in the 20th century. cartographers did not feel the need to mention Mongols, any Mongols where nowadays Mongolia is. They would usually place them in two places in Siberia, this map being just one example out of the countless. Two places with Mongols in Siberia and none in current Mongolia. Only at the later stages in 17th and 18th century we start seeing some sort of Mugalia or Mugalie on the maps, which later on evolved into Mongolia. So the people of nowadays Mongolia are just one out of the many descendants of nations that called themselves Mongols. Countless old drawings and paintings depict the Mongols as clearly Caucasian people with turbans on their heads. For example, this is what the ambassador in Moscow from Western Europe saw on his reception upon arrival in Russia. And just a remark for those of you who like to read the Bible, some of the areas, because there are 4 or 5 general areas on the old maps that appear with name Mongol. Two of them are in Siberia, and one of them gradually transforms into the kingdom of Gog and Magog. And here some old Bible original text. It says with Cyrillic letters, this is not a translation, Magoga Kniaza Roska. Of course, this, in later editions it gets scrambled beyond recognition. And by the way, those Mongols that it invaded, took over Europe and Asia, were the same people that we call Mongols or Moguls nowadays. They were not Mongolians. The Mongolians were a small and not very significant part of the Mogul culture. They were not all the Moguls or Mughals. And actually, honestly, looking at the older maps, there are many Mongol places, but usually India is the one that comes with the biggest letters, and it's the most frequent one. It says with the big letters. Magna Mongol, the great empire of the Mongols. Although various alternative forms are used nowadays, like Mughal, even Mongol in its pure form is still used till date. It doesn't mean that the Indians are Mongolians, though. Actually, till date, Mongol means a rich, influential person. Any person of any race, not necessarily Mongolian. This is, for example, how the Mongol warriors would look like, and this is what the modern so-called historians are trying to convince us they looked like, and this is a so-called restoration of an old painting. Very professionally they restored it indeed. That is why India is one amazing place for spirituality, because in the times of the earlier waves of survivors, they managed to write down in almost unaltered form the spiritual knowledge of the survivors in the form of the Vedic literature. And later on, through the ages, they remained loyal, at least relatively most loyal to the survivor culture. For example, the famous masterpiece of Taj Mahal. It is well famous as a Muslim thing, and yet below the layers of restoration and more recent work, Hindu elements surface out. And what is the result? Till date, Hindus and Muslims fight each other and kill each other for nothing. Well, that's not the only reason, but this is just one small detail of how divide and conquer is implemented. If Hindus and Muslims were aware what was the real history, and that is Hinduism and Islam and all other religions were at one time one single thing. And Taj Mahal is a very good evidence of it, because what they find is they find mixed Hindu and Muslim symbols in the oldest layers. But instead of realizing that it was all one at those times, they fight. And so the so-called Muslim rulers of India, God knows how purely Muslim they were in reality, the Mongols, the Moguls, whichever pronunciation you choose, they also were loyal to this ancient Vedic survivor tradition. Look at this old image of Kremlin. The style of dressing and the interior is purely Mongol, Mughal, whatever you want to call it. And not only all men were wearing the same turbans on their heads. Pay attention to what the Indian mademoiselles wear on their heads. They wear crowns of style that is identical to that of the Tartaria princesses. The Indians kept carefully for us not only the literature of the survivors but also their outfits. This is what the ladies wear in India on the street even nowadays. These are Indian fashion shows, and these are fashion shows from the West where the advanced people live. And how did they deserve the label advanced? Not only because they are pioneers in poisoning and polluting Mother Earth, or to be more precise, organizing and overseeing that pollution in places like India, but primarily they are labeled as advanced because their citizens are more generously awarded gadgets like smartphones. Those are reward gifts for implementing the parasitic agenda of fully poisoning the planet and executing it on ground level. And the most dangerous type of poisoning is the poisoning with parasitic beliefs. And indeed, parasitic is the most suitable word, because here in the advanced world of parasites, it is completely normal that people starve by millions and just a handful of them, some 3 or 5%, own the planet. That's really parasitic. Mainstream historians assure us that not only Genghis Khan conquered 2 continents, but he also ruled over a large part of the conquered territories for some 300 years. That yoke only ended, continue the historians, in 15th century. Sounds like a grand empire to me. Has it left any artifacts or writings of some sort? Well, not really, no artifacts, but the historians have come up with writings. And indeed, they have found one stone that appears to have Mongolian signs on it. They also say that the Persian novel is actually Mongolian. It was never studied before as Mongolian because it looks Persian, and they themselves continue. It is actually in Tartar language, they say, but the signs must be Mongolian. Well, how convincing. Two other pieces of writing have suddenly emerged in European private libraries. And if we believe a translator called Schmidt, they must be Mongolian, although the writing of the two documents differs, and it differs from the stone as well. And in addition, they have been found under suspicious circumstances. But if Schmidt says, then we can build the world history upon his honest word. On the image, you see Marco Polo again visiting Mongolian king. To make it look Mongolian, the so-called historians, they just can't are ready to tell anything. Like, these scripts were not studied before, because if you look at them, they look like Turkish. And also the descendants of the Mongols, according to that novel that they are talking about, are actually Turkish people. Very strange that the Turks are not aware that they are actually Mongolians. My cat suffers from the same problem. He thinks he's actually a lion. But luckily we have historians in penguin suits who are here to tell us who are we, and so we cannot make mistakes like the cat or like the Turks, who actually think they're Turks but they're actually Mongolians. So those few signs on the stone and the other writings that we must believe are Mongolian somehow, though they don't match, is all we have left of this empire that ruled for hundreds of years. Strange. Do you remember the Arabic chronicle where the translator was forced to add the names and locations according to his knowledge? Well, it is very often quoted by mainstream historians, but strange that they only quote some parts that were maybe later on added, and don't like to quote other parts. For example, the ones that describe the appearance of Genghis Khan as a blonde man with blue eyes. Other historic records describe in the same way his sons. Well, the old images are not included in the history books and quotes as well, and this is how the new Genghis Khan looks like. But if indeed the Mongolian army was plundering for hundreds of years vast territory of the world out of its riches, it must have had some artifacts, from the plundering, or some sort of capital, or any sophisticated culture, anything at all. It's just zero. It's not there. I mean, Mongolians are very simple shepherds, and in recent years, when more and more of them started becoming literate, for their great surprise, they learned from the Westerners that they have been ruling the world at one point. They had no clue about it before that. Yes, really, all these monuments of Genghis Khan in Mongolia were erected after they heard from the West about their history. They do not have any legend stating that they have ever ruled anything, actually. Yes, they did have great Khans, but those were the Khans of Tartaria that they were always part of. As far as any of the Mongolian tribes ruling continents, this is just absolutely non-existent in their folklore. The main task of every good mainstream historian is just copy and paste. But there are exceptions, and Eric Middleford is one of them. He used to work in various European historical archives, and actually he started reading the old books. He noticed very strange ideas spreading amongst the nobles and clergy of Europe in the 16th century. He found numerous unrelated records that in various parts of Europe, men of high position were trembling with fear and suffering from severe paranoia that tomorrow the Tatars and Mongols are invading again. how is that possible if those were really from Mongolia and some century before that they already lost their strength and were no longer holding Asia? How could they arrive in Europe tomorrow by flight or Middleford really found out a lot of genuine records of otherwise absolutely sane people suffering from this very strange paranoia, even to the point that one, for example, was sleeping with full body military armor at night out of fear that the Mongols may knock on his window. Middleford decided that they must have suffered from some extremely weird mental disease, and these ideas were even contagious and also infecting only noble people and clergy. Well, his hypothesis is not less weird than the virus that infected the nobles, but in the light of the new chronology history, all this fits perfectly very well, because in the 16th century, still the Tartars and Mongols were there where they have always been in Tartaria, and it is entirely possible that there were rumors that they are going to conquer Europe again. As we know, during the 15th century, that was the time when their empire flourished and included Europe. Please note that I am narrating these historical events not because I approve them or I endorse the very idea of some big empire, just on the contrary. The full point of the Survivor series is to point out how normal people were gradually tricked into empires, countries, and other limitations just to lose their freedom. I'm only telling the truth about all the past empires to see how we exactly made the mistakes, how we were tricked into them so that we stop making them and really turn into free people. Let's now see how the modern fairy tale myth about the Genghis Khan of Mongolia is perpetuated in the modern society with the help of mass media. Spicy articles assure us that scientists have found out that half percent of the full population of Earth now are descendants of Genghis Khan, and colorful diagrams are added that nobody understands so that it makes it look scientific. It is soon even turned into some sort of business and show, and you can even spend money to test yourself if you're descendant of Genghis Khan. Here and there, a few voices calling for sanity are writing articles that this is impossible, but when the monster big media, the mass media, supports it with spicy titles, we owe it all to the superstud Genghis Khan, people believe that's real science and even line up in queues for the medical tests without giving the full thing any thinking at all. So these newspaper articles assure us that this fantastic lover, Genghis Khan, really shagged anything he could get his hands on, reaching in millions. Why millions? Why the numbers didn't grow exponentially naturally as the articles are trying to imply? Well, because that's impossible, and here it is why. To have half percent of the population of Earth be his direct descendants now, he must have managed to make a baby into half percent of the millions of women living at that time. It is not that most of the work was done by his sons, because most of his imaginary millions of sons would have been in reality bastards, meaning the parents don't live together and would be treated very unequally in the society that they were born on, and their chances for creating a further progeny would be much less than average. and it is only his legitimate sons which would be very few, let's say maximum a dozen or something, or even a few dozen if you say, only they would have this opportunity to propagate, to shag more women, to rape more women in this fantasy scenario of the Mongolian takeover of Europe and Asia. The estimated world population at Genghis Khan's time was some 400 million people. Let's say half were women. So half percent of that would be 1 million women. To make 1 million women pregnant, he must have raped, I don't know what is it, 20 or 30,000 million women, because not every rape results in pregnancy. Moreover, unwanted children were often killed before they appear in this world. I mean, there were village shamans at that time. The lady would go and ask for herbs to remove the unwanted embryo. Even if his sons were all complete sex maniacs and were raping women all day long, still they couldn't cover all these millions of female population, because as I said earlier, only very few of them, just the legitimate ones, would have a possibility to rape anybody they wish. And the most of his actual sons, hypothetically all these, would have much less reduced possibilities of having children of their own because of their subdued social position. So it will offset, that itself will offset the privileges that the legitimate ones have. Many rulers and other important men are nowadays considered to have been great shaggers, like Genghis Khan is being presented. If they were indeed able to leave such a DNA imprint upon the world population in terms of percentage, since there have been so many of them throughout history, hundreds, then what would be left for ordinary people? All the DNA would be taken by these great shaggers. 100% wouldn't be even enough, and nothing would be left for the ordinary folks. In some of these newspaper articles, one can find a bit more correct information, but it is never in the titles. It is somewhere towards the end they actually hint that the actual scientific research, all that it boils down to eventually, is that a certain group of people belong to certain group, and on the basis of that they have decided that it must have a single father, and following some logic of theirs, there could be no other man except Genghis Khan who could have done it, and all this information is taken, of course, from the history. There is nothing Mongolian about this group either. It is connected to Asia for sure. Geographically, that's where it is found most of all. But that's all that there is truth to it. Some group is prevalent in Asia. Well, there are groups of DNA all over the planet. Of course, people are related on the continents. All this is very depictive of how the newspaper articles, and especially their titles with big letters, can really create very wrong impressions in people about their true history. In this case, all this full story of Genghis Khan seems to be reinforced and confirmed by the DNA study, while in reality the DNA so-called study is actually based on this fiction. The story is also very depictive of how the so-called DNA science can easily become one of the strong pillars of what I call the TV religion, means believe everything that TV tells you, for the simple reason that they can just tell any nonsense and then say, oh, it is a result of scientific research, and they are not obliged to provide the base data of this research, or even if they have to, it's so easy to manufacture. Just take a computer and type any string of anything you want. Who can check if these studies were really performed on thousands of people as claimed? And what were the real results? Another highly questionable, supposedly scientific research is the one establishing that we have all come out of Africa. Really, did we? So to summarize, what was the need of creating this historical myth sometime in the 18th century? Why so late? Well, they couldn't do it earlier because Tartaria was still existing, and the people down the street knew what is happening. It was still fresh in their memory. But once, after a couple of generations, the memory started fading, they started fabricating the myth. And why was it so important to make Genghis Khan look Mongolian? Well, because the uh, country of Tartaria didn't even exist according to the new history, so they had to uh, assign the invasion to somebody else. So Mongolia, that's the one. It's not true that everybody in Tartaria was just a descendant of the survivors. That's far away from the truth. But it happened so that the rulers over there stuck to the old values for longest time, maybe because it was nearest to Hyperborea, or for some other reason, we don't know exactly why. Once they erased the state of Tartaria on the map, they started deleting the very memory of it from the pages of the history, and the remaining small pockets here and there of a survivor culture, like Japan, China, Native American tribes, Ethiopia, the Catars of France, Pop Bogumil in Bulgaria, they were just an easy prey because basically they were small groups of people. And for those of you who still may doubt that Genghis Khan has anything to do with Mongolia specifically, they may wonder, well, but he's mentioned in so many foreign chronicles. We see quotes of on the internet. You will find this is a depiction of Genghis Khan in Japanese chronicle, in Chinese chronicle. What about those? Well, Genghis Khan is not a proper personal name. It means the great Khan. So this makes it very convenient to match any Khan, any ruler you wish, to him. It is so easy because most rulers are described, at least in one place, as great. Actually, if you decide to spend some time in a serious study, you will find out that the mainstream historians even have no clue what was the name of Genghis Khan in Mongolian at the time he was supposedly ruling it. It is that much a lack of any information about him in Mongolia itself. The way they give it written and pronounced in Mongolian language, that is in modern Mongolian language. At his time, in his epoch, completely different language was used, as they themselves admit, and they have no clue. I mean, they have different versions, but it is not even clear what was his name at that time. Various maps were shown and also the year of their making. Please note that those years of making are probably not correct. Probably these are much more recent copies. of the original maps after they have been corrected with the correct history. But anyway, the years given are according to mainstream history.